This is the action from the 1867 Chickering 33B concert grand piano. And now that I have it cleaned up a bit, I thought we'd take a closer look. Here on end grain is the brown action from the 1867 33B. Basically the same shape as any grand piano action. Keys to the front, action to the rear. Where this action differs is in the mechanics between the two. And we'll take a closer look at those in a moment. But what I wanted to draw attention to was the woods that this thing is made of. Maple for the action parts, some nice pine for the keys, but everything else seems to be made of walnut, cherry, more walnut. This whole structure is walnut. That's a cherry rail. That's a cherry rail. Walnut and cherry are actually very nice structural woods. They're dense, they're stable, and in 1867, I guess cherry was available in sizes large enough to make rails out of, and walnut wasn't regarded so highly that it had to be only used for decorative purposes. And here we see those woods employed in a hidden mechanical application, and it's part of what makes the charm of the mid-19th century. Wood is good stuff, and you can do amazing things with it. So let's take a closer look at the action. Okay, this is an awkward angle, but from it you can see all the major functioning points of the action. The action consists of the key here, which is the big teeter-totter part of the action. Mounted to it is a stick called the jack that also is a type of lever. It has a foot over here that will help kick it out. Between the jack and the actual hammer and shank is a lever called the underhammer in a Chickering, and it acts as a separator, a transfer of energy between the tip of the jack and the underside of the shank. So when you press on the key, it lifts the jack lifts the underhammer, and the underhammer lifts the shank and its hammer. As so. The jack has a little arm extension on it that reaches over towards a little button on a rail, and that's the let-off button on the let-off rail. And when the hammer goes up and reaches a certain point close to the strings to keep things from jamming, that lever pulls the tip of the jack out from underneath the underhammer and allows the hammer to fall back away from the strings so that it doesn't block or bobble. There is a spring inside this housing that pushes up on this underhammer and down on this little table behind the back, mounted to the back of the jack, that pulls the jack back under the underhammer, and if things are working well, also tends to lift the underhammer a little bit to give the jack a little better chance to get under. That's all about helping the repetition. Those are kind of the standard aspects of this action. What's quite bizarre is this zone through here. This is a really early version, and I'm surprised to see a flat face on this, because it means that when you press the key, the only part of this felt that's actually touching the shank is this little corner right there. And while it might be an efficient movement, there's a certain subtlety lost to it, and it tends to beat that little section of felt down. The later versions of this had a slightly curved face on this. I may be able to find some old parts around to show that, but the curved face, while going through this motion, would rock a bit on the whole face, and it tended to feel smoother to the touch, I think, and also added a little bit of a variable action ratio element, inside baseball kind of phenomenon here. It's easier to push the shank from here, but once you got it going, your best acceleration would be from here. So by using a rounded surface, they can start over here, and by the end of the stroke they're over here, so that the shank has the whole system has a built-in ratio enhancer, and it gives the feeling of a meatiness to the stroke. The hammer doesn't get away from the force so readily, and it adds a nice tactile definition to the stroke. Here we can see the inside faces of these parts. There's the top of the underhammer. You can see where most of its wear took place. And there's the underside of the platen. I'm not sure what you'd want to call that. And of course you can see the corresponding mark on it, showing where it was driven from. But this system was used from the 1840s to the 1890s. I have one here from 1890, so it's not like it wasn't a successful action, and it went through periods of development, so attention was paid to it. It wasn't a static action, and quite a number of famous musicians favored it quite openly. So let's start taking it apart, and I'll show you the components as we go. The first part to come off would be this right here. This is the let-off rail. It holds these little blocks that have the buttons on them. So it's held in by screws into the walnut rail, and off it comes. See, it's a pretty straightforward construction. Um, Little blocks screwed to a rail. Screws going through. What I would note is that these pads on the end are actually very soft buckskin. In time, pianos were all made with, a felt cushion there. But on this, they're using buckskin. And I was told by someone, a collector of watches, that there are some miracle cleaning agents that can get stuff out of leather without ruining it. I've never had much luck doing anything with dirty leather, and this stuff is pretty filthy. I don't hold out much hope for it. But if I can get my hands on some of that miracle leather restorer, I will give it a shot and see if these aren't savable. Otherwise, I'm just going to have to recover those in fresh buckskin. But all in all, this is just gorgeous. It's got one little, good old college try repair, which I'm glad they did. So, not much wrong with this, and it'll restore nicely. And of course, the next part to come off is one of the larger components, the hammer rail with all the hammers and shanks. And it is held on with screws down through the top into the wooden frame. So, I'm not sure if this is going to come out and be visible, but before I pulled this off, I wanted to show a little detail. If you look at that white layer of felt, it's pretty clear that over the last 150 years, it has been hammered into basically a wedge shape. It's thinner at this end than at that. I really like to conserve every piece that I can in a piano, even the cloth if it's possible. But what you're seeing there in that hammering down is actually a continuation of the felting process that took place when it was new. When it was new, they hammered it so that it was even thickness. Now, it's been further hammered into this wedge shape, and that can't be undone. You can't soak it, twist it, do anything. It'll always be thinner at one end than the other because the the follicles have entangled just that much more deeply. And this was just a really good example, and I wanted to record it before I moved on. Here I have the hammer rail flipped over, so you can see the underside, and here are the jacks and under hammers. You can see how they work a little more clearly there. And here are the undersides of the shank platens. I'm not sure what to call them, but you can see how there's the real contact point, and that's what they pushed on. These items right here are screwed to the bottom of it, of the hammer rail, and what they do is they stop the jacks from coming out too far. There's a little interconnection between these two. If the jacks come out and can go back in, this is a little, but if you go too far, the whole thing can come apart. So there's a limiter here to keep that from disengaging. But the next and most tricky part to come off is this rail down here, the underhammer rail. And the complication comes in, as I said, because the jack from the key and the underhammer itself are tied together a little bit and have to be separated. And you have to do that a little rather gently, but you get all of these separated, and then this rail will come off, leaving just the keys with the jacks mounted. So let me disentangle these. Press just ever so slightly to keep the parts from grating on each other. Push the jack all the way back, and the butterfly spring will open things up. Okay, before I pull it off, see if we can't show a little bit of this internal relationship. I mean, you can see the top of the butterfly spring that goes into a slot right there, and maybe you can see the bottom of the butterfly spring down that little red felt channel right there, and little leather tabs. But those little leather tabs and these little metal feet are what are engaged to keep this locked together. So, right, time to pull it apart. Okay, here's the underhammer rail off, and you can see the levers that moved about. But more importantly, there's the butterfly spring. As you can see, it's a pretty strong spring, and it was pressing on the underside of this in that channel. And the other end was pressing into that channel. So it had a tendency to want to pull the jack back under so that the note could repeat. It also had and at the same time it had the tendency to want to push up on the underhammer to make room for the jack to go back into this notch. So that's the repetition system in a Brown action. There was one last strip of wood in the action that I forgot to mention. It's this one. This is the key upstop rail, and it was attached to the back side of the, what do you call it, underhammer rail, and it just kept the keys from going up too high, so that gave the action a nice positive feel. And it's a simple enough rail, and the felt's in really nice shape, and I just wanted to show this as well. Well, that's it for parts that have to come off of the action frame. But before we can get the keys out, there's still the last piece, and this is the key stop rail. It's supposed to stop the key from bouncing too much, I guess, and it's the last piece that got to come out. It's held down with these nice little toggles, so I'll pull that out. And when you take the nut off and lift the rail, you find that the underside of the rail has a very precise recess to fit a brass collar threaded onto the stem below. So between the two of them, they lock it in place. This is a pretty common feature in pianos. One detail I wanted to show was that underneath the brass collar there is a bit of, I'm not sure what the material is, it feels like some kind of very stiff thread, but it's knotted onto this post. And I was thinking, why would they have that? And I remember there are a few times that I have found where the lower knob on this system, if the upper one comes loose, nothing's really holding the lower one. And if the lower one vibrates down the shaft, I've seen it where it has gone down to where it's further down the shaft than the key can come up, so it winds up holding one of your keys down. It just won't come up all the way. So this little adaptation prevents it. I also love this shade of green on this felt. That stays. And at long last, we're down to the keys. Before I pull one out, I wanted to acknowledge what the eagle-eyed might have already noticed, that it's a bit of a color change right about here. And the last time I had this apart, I just couldn't resist seeing how they'd clean up. So you can see there's just a lot of surface dirt that comes off, a lot of applications of DAG 57, a celluloid grease, which is not an evil substance, but it can be put to evil use, that's for certain. And, a lot of graphite smear around. And I'm pretty sure that I don't know what that stuff is. I'm going to have to be really careful with that. That could be ink, could be coffee. I don't know, but I'm going to clean the keys pretty carefully, and I'll show you how I go about that. But as long as the contrast was staring me in the face, I figured I'd show something. So let's pull one of these keys out. And this is the basic makeup of the key for the 33B. It's got a good number of fairly small leads in it, which doesn't necessarily mean anything bad, just noteworthy. The chief difference between this and a modern piano is that one way or another this would be mounted to something secondary in the action so that the key didn't actually have the jack riding on it. But we'll see whether this is a more efficient system. And the one thing I'd point out is this little leather and felt tab. It's mounted to a metal pin that goes through. And the nice felted channel in the back. Did such nice felt work back then. The back check, this is really beautiful buckskin. That's going to be hard to source, but if you can see some of these other ones, they're so worn through, some are so cut up that I can't save them. And it never ceases to amaze me how evenly spaced these old actions are. When you figure these pieces of wood were cut up into separate sticks 150 years ago, they have stayed incredibly stable. A few shiftings, but nothing major. So I'm going to pull the keys out of the way and we can take a look at the keyframe. And finally, we're down to the keyframe itself. So there's something interesting about every rail. The back rail, balance rail, and the front rail. So let's take a look at the back rail first. Okay, this is the back rail. And it's, I suppose, a little surprisingly, but not terribly surprising, it's just a single layer of felt. But the felt itself is quite interesting. I'm not sure if I can capture this. Let me see if I can zoom in a bit. Too much. I'm not sure if you can see this, but the underside of the felt is a nice, closely trimmed nap, while on the upper surface has a long, shaggy nap that goes one direction. I've cleaned this up a bit since we found it, but it's kind of a special piece of felt in that there's no evidence of a long nap on the bottom. So this piece of felt was made with a clean side and a nappy side. I don't know if that's the right word. But I think this little extra layer of hairs help quiet this down a bit. But that's a piece of felt I don't know where I would find another one like it, because they simply don't make it. And here we have a closer view of the balance rail. And the interesting thing about this rail is that in front of each pin they have machined off a little ledge. And what this does is it changes the natural pivot point of the key from like the front of this felt back into the middle of it, meaning that the full length of the felt supports the bottom of the key, and in the twisting it doesn't lift up onto the pin very much. It also helps with the weight dynamics of the key. It has become a fashionable solution recently to sort of mimic this by nipping off the front edge of the balance rail felts rather, to create that little bit of a ledge in the felt itself. But in this case, the manufacturer built it into the system, and there's a similar ledge back here on the balance rail. So the same principle is being applied to both pivot points. And this, of course, is the front rail, and it's pretty straightforward, but I think something that needs to be shown for these Chickerings is that the older ones, they had one 2mm piece of felt, and then they had a second thin felt, and a third thin felt underneath it, and below those is where they put the paper punchings actually for controlling the dip. Now, I really want to save these felts. But some of them are pretty beat up and some are pretty dirty, and so I'm going to have to go to some extreme lengths here and see if I can't pull it off. Okay, the last detail I wanted to share was this sticker. You will find these labels inside Victorian Chickerings, and they always have a 4-digit number on them, somebody's name, and sometimes a date or the model number. This one is 3691, and that is the number of the action, and it may actually still also be the number of the case. It's not the serial number. Serial number on this one is 31,000 something. But that's how the factory kept things separate. And I just want to say that it's not the serial number because a lot of people think that it might be, because, well, there's usually only one spot on these old Chickerings where they actually put the serial number. And if that's lost, well, that piece of information is also lost. The other piece of information on this one is the name Santamant. I've seen his name a few times in these older instruments. Santamant, Asa Rugg we find, and there's also a Mr. Churchill that shows up quite a bit. His name is not usually on the keys. that's the name of the craftsman who assembled the action, maybe even made it from scratch. I have no idea. And the 67 in this case is the year the piano was made. So we take great pains to not damage those labels because they're just so nice. One last little detail of this action I thought I'd share. Mentioned that it was action frame was made of wood. Here's that one from the corner, and well, as it turns out, the action is screwed together but not glued together, which was surprising. So I took it apart, makes it a bit easier to clean, and thought you'd like to see this.